"I'm awarding the promotion to Evan," Mr. Dalton announced, his finger tapping the conference table as 40 pairs of eyes turned toward me. "Not Laurel. She supports the team well, but she's not leadership material." My throat tightened. The blood drained from my face as colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding the table fascinating. My presentation, the one I'd spent 3 weeks building from scratch, still glowed on the screen behind him. He'd used my work, stolen the recognition, and now crushed me publicly. I sat frozen, nails digging into my palms beneath the table. Then his mistake crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. He'd forgotten I controlled the systems that controlled him. Every performance metric he relied on passed through my hands first. Every report that made him look competent came from my analysis. Every audit trail that kept him compliant existed because I maintained it. He thought I was powerless. He was catastrophically wrong. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe properly. Mr. Dalton smiled like he'd just done something courageous. "Let's all congratulate Evan," he said, starting the applause himself. The sound of forced clapping felt like knives scraping against my skull. Evan looked down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable. At least he had the decency to appear embarrassed. Around the table, a few people met my eyes with sympathy. Most avoided looking at me entirely. In that moment, behind my clenched teeth, a single sentence formed. He thinks I'm powerless. But he'd forgotten something crucial. Something that would prove to be his downfall. Every compliance report, every efficiency metric, every piece of data that kept our division running smoothly. All of it flowed through systems I managed. Systems he barely understood but depended on completely. He just humiliated the one person who made him look competent. And I would let the consequences unfold naturally. That moment, sitting in silence while a man erased my contributions, became the day everything changed. My name is Laurel Pritchard, and this is how I made the most arrogant leader in our company fall simply by letting truth speak louder than his ego ever could. But to understand my calm, you need to understand what led us to that conference room. You need to know why I recognized his vulnerability instantly. For 6 months, I'd been promised that promotion. My direct manager, Ms. Torres, had pulled me aside multiple times. "You're next in line. Everyone knows you already run operations," she'd said warmly. I'd believed her completely. I'd stayed late countless nights, coached new analysts, trained teams across 2 departments. I'd become the backbone everyone leaned on without realizing it. "And Dalton," he'd always said, "you're indispensable, Laurel." I hadn't understood that meant too useful to promote. The pattern became clear about 3 months before the meeting. I started noticing who actually got promoted around here. Guys Dalton grabbed lunch with at the sports bar down the street. People who laughed loudest at his jokes during meetings. People who played golf on weekends. People who joined him for drinks every Friday after work. Never the women doing the heavy analytical lifting. Never the quiet ones like me who made things run smoothly. Every time I'd asked about my promotion timeline, he'd given the same answer. "Patience, Laurel. Loyalty matters here." Loyalty apparently meant silence. It meant accepting less while delivering more. One Thursday afternoon, he'd presented my entire metrics deck to the executive team. I'd sat in the back row, watching him click through slides I'd created, explain insights I'd discovered, recommend strategies I'd developed. He never mentioned my name once. Afterward, he'd patted my shoulder. "Good support work, Laurel." Support. That word started feeling like chains. 2 weeks before the fateful meeting, HR had pulled me aside informally. "You're the strongest candidate for the operations manager position," the HR coordinator whispered. "Just keep doing what you're doing. It's basically decided." Her words had filled me with hope and validation. But then, 1 week later, Dalton had asked me to train Evan on several key systems. "Just to help him get familiar with operations," he'd explained casually. "Cross-training benefits everyone." Something inside me had tightened with suspicion. Why did Evan, who worked in business development, suddenly need access to operational systems. Why was Dalton asking me to share knowledge I'd spent years accumulating? Complied, of course. What choice did I have? But I'd also started documenting everything carefully. Every training session, every system access request, every file I shared. Something told me I'd need that documentation later. I just hadn't known how soon that moment would arrive, or how publicly Dalton would betray me. 2 days before the team meeting, Dalton had emailed me directly. Send me the final operations performance document. I need it for Monday's announcement. The document contained my complete evaluation of departmental efficiency over the past year. Data I'd collected meticulously. Analysis I'd performed independently. Recommendations I'd developed after months of research. He hadn't read it carefully. I knew because he'd never asked clarifying questions. He depended on me to interpret everything, to make him look informed and competent. But that document also contained clear evidence that my work had directly increased department efficiency by 37%. By requesting it formally through email, he'd created a traceable digital footprint tying all the analysis directly back to me. He just handed me proof of my contributions. He simply didn't realize it yet. When Monday morning arrived, I'd walked into that conference room carrying my laptop, my documentation, and a strange sense of calm. The meeting had started normally enough. Dalton had opened with his usual self-congratulatory remarks about departmental success. He'd clicked through my slides, presenting my findings as though they were collaborative team efforts. Then he'd reached the final slide. Leadership transition. My heart had started pounding. This was it. The moment Ms. Torres had promised. The promotion I'd earned through countless late nights and weekend work. As we expand operations, Dalton had said smoothly, we need strong leadership at the management level. I'd straightened in my chair, preparing to accept graciously. I'm awarding the promotion to Evan, he'd continued, not even glancing my direction. Not Laurel. She supports the team well, but she's not leadership material. The words had hit me like physical blows. My ears had rung. The room had blurred around the edges. But I hadn't cried, hadn't stormed out, hadn't defended myself publicly. I'd simply sat there, watching him dig his own grave. The meeting had ended with Dalton's dismissive instruction. Laurel, pack up the training materials for Evan. He'll need everything organized by Wednesday. People had filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact with me. In the hallway afterward, a coworker named Brianna had touched my arm gently. That was completely messed up, she'd whispered. I'm so sorry, Laurel. I'd nodded, but I'd felt strangely calm, almost detached. My revenge wouldn't be anger or confrontation. It would be clarity and precision. Dalton thought the systems I managed were merely clerical tasks. He didn't understand they formed the backbone of executive accountability across our entire division. He didn't realize his quarterly performance review depended entirely on data I compiled and verified. He just publicly humiliated the person who'd been protecting his reputation for 2 years. And now I would stop protecting him. Not through sabotage, not through rule-breaking, simply through strict adherence to protocol. I didn't sabotage anything that week. I didn't break a single company policy. I simply followed every procedure exactly as written in the compliance manual. Every discrepancy I'd previously fixed quietly to make Dalton look competent. I stopped correcting them. Every overdue report he'd asked me to just take care of without proper authorization. I filed them with timestamps and missing signature documentation. Every approval he'd skipped because he was too busy. I logged it officially. Within days, small cracks started appearing in his carefully constructed image. The division's compliance score dipped slightly. Nothing catastrophic, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. Budget reconciliation reports showed inconsistencies he'd always asked me to smooth over before submission. Project timelines revealed gaps in oversight he'd previously claimed credit for managing. I simply stopped being the invisible safety net that had kept him looking professional. 1 week after the meeting, corporate compliance sent an inquiry. "We're seeing unusual patterns in Dalton's division," the email stated. "Several reports appear out of standard compliance. Please clarify." Dalton had stormed to my desk, his face flushed with panic. "Laurel, fix this," he'd hissed, shoving a printout at me. "Corporate is asking questions." I'd looked up calmly from my computer. "I'm sorry, but according to policy section 4.7, I can't modify audit logs retroactively without written authorization from 2 department heads." His jaw had clenched visibly. "You know what I mean. Just make it look right." "That would violate compliance standards," I'd replied evenly. "I can't do that." My calmness had scared him more than yelling ever could. He'd stood there for a long moment, clearly wanting to explode but aware that others could hear our conversation. Finally, he'd walked away stiffly. Behind him, I'd returned to my work, heart pounding but hands steady. Evan had approached me 2 days later in the break room. We'd been alone. He'd looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Laurel, I need to say something," he'd started, clutching his coffee cup. "I didn't know Dalton was going to announce it like that. I didn't ask for this promotion. Honestly, I don't even want it." He'd looked ashamed. Maybe he was being sincere. "I told him you should get the position," Evan had continued. "You do all the actual work. Everyone knows that." I'd appreciated his honesty, but it hadn't changed anything. "It's not your fault," I'd said quietly. "But the damage is done." Evan was part of the system now, whether he liked it or not. He'd accepted the promotion. His name was on the announcement. And while he might feel guilty, he wasn't giving the position back. The following week, I'd had to train him on advanced reporting systems he couldn't possibly master in time. Watching him struggle had been oddly satisfying. 3 weeks after the promotion announcement, Dalton's quarterly performance review was due. Every quarter, I compiled a comprehensive summary of divisional operations. This document fed directly into executive evaluations and determined annual bonuses. Normally, I'd clean the data carefully, smoothing over Dalton's oversights and highlighting team successes as his personal achievements. This quarter I did something different. I submitted exactly what the raw logs showed. Missed approval deadlines, 17 instances, all requiring his signature. Unreviewed budget allocations, 9 projects started without proper authorization. Delayed compliance reports, 6 submissions past their due dates. Everything was factual. Everything was his direct responsibility. I hadn't fabricated anything. Hadn't exaggerated. I'd simply stopped covering for him. The truth, presented without my usual diplomatic editing, painted a very different picture of his leadership capabilities. I'd submitted the report through proper channels and waited. Consequences would follow naturally. 2 senior directors appeared in our office unannounced on a Wednesday morning. "We're here to verify workflow discrepancies," one director announced to Dalton. "We need to review several operational processes." Dalton's confident smile had faltered immediately. He'd stammered through attempted explanations, clearly caught off guard. The directors had requested specific documentation, approval chains, budget authorizations, compliance timelines. Dalton had looked at me desperately. "Laurel handles those systems. She can provide whatever you need." Both directors had turned to me with interest. "Ms. Pritchard, can you pull those records?" one had asked. "Of course," I'd replied calmly. "I maintain comprehensive logs of all operational workflows." I'd provided exactly what they'd requested. Every document properly dated and attributed. Every gap in oversight clearly visible. I hadn't added commentary. Hadn't pointed out problems. The documentation spoke for itself. And it was devastating. Dalton had called me into his office that afternoon. The door had barely closed before he'd exploded. "You're deliberately making me look bad," he'd accused, voice shaking with anger. "What's your problem, Laurel?" I'd met his eyes steadily. "I'm following company policy exactly as written." You know what I mean. His face had turned red. You're sabotaging me. I'm documenting workflow accurately, I'd replied calmly. That's literally my job description. He'd leaned forward, trying to intimidate me with proximity. You need to fix this situation. There's nothing to fix. The logs are accurate. Silence had stretched between us, tense and hostile. I hadn't backed down. Hadn't apologized. Hadn't offered to help. Silence has tremendous power when you're absolutely certain you're right. Eventually, Dalton had dismissed me with a furious wave. I'd walked out with my head high, knowing the truth was working faster than any revenge I could have planned. The directors had returned the following week with more questions. This time, they'd brought the division's compliance officer. They'd requested audit trails, project ownership documentation, and approval histories for the past 2 years, all of which clearly demonstrated one uncomfortable truth. The person actually running operations was me, not Dalton, and certainly not Evan, who'd been promoted barely a month ago. The documentation showed my fingerprints on every successful project, my analysis driving every strategic decision, my oversight preventing every potential compliance violation. Dalton's contributions, mostly signature approvals on documents he hadn't read carefully. During the review, one director had asked me directly, Ms. Pritchard, how would you characterize your role in this division? Chosen my words carefully. I implement operational strategy, maintain compliance systems, analyze performance data, and coordinate cross-departmental workflows. And Mr. Dalton's role? He provides executive oversight and client relations. The director had made a note. And Mr. Novak's new role. He's currently in training. No accusations. No complaints. Just facts. HR had contacted me the next day. Ms. Pritchard, we'd like to speak with you privately, the email had stated. Please schedule a confidential meeting this week. My heart had pounded as I'd walked to the HR office. This was either very good or very bad. The HR director, Ms. Kumar, had greeted me warmly. Thank you for coming, Laurel. We've been reviewing organizational structure and have noticed some discrepancies between official job titles and actual responsibilities. She'd opened a file folder. Your official title is Operations Coordinator, correct? Yes. But your actual duties include strategic planning, compliance management, performance analysis, and cross-departmental coordination. That's accurate. Those responsibilities typically align with an operations manager position, the role recently given to Mr. Novak. I'd nodded, staying quiet. Can you walk me through your typical responsibilities? For the next hour, I'd answered questions carefully and factually. I hadn't exaggerated, hadn't complained, hadn't named anyone specifically. I'd simply described what I actually did every day. Ms. Kumar's expression had shifted from curious to concerned to almost angry. That same week, something unexpected happened. Someone, I never learned who, escalated the situation directly to the company's board of directors. Dalton had no idea. He'd continued strutting around the office, pretending everything was fine, still barking orders at me like I was his assistant. But I'd seen the meeting invitations in the shared calendar. Executive Performance Review. Urgent. Operational Compliance Audit. Board Level. Personnel Structure Analysis. Storm clouds were gathering above Dalton's head, and he was standing in the open, completely unaware. Meanwhile, colleagues had started treating me differently. People asked my opinion in meetings more directly. Copied me on emails they'd previously sent only to Dalton. Requested my input on decisions. It was subtle but significant. The informal power structure was shifting, even though the formal hierarchy hadn't changed yet. Brianna had pulled me aside one afternoon. Whatever you're doing, she'd whispered. Keep doing it. Dalton's been getting called into closed-door meetings constantly. I'd simply smiled. Evan had cracked under the pressure. He'd stopped me in the hallway looking absolutely miserable. They're asking where the performance metrics actually come from, he'd said quietly, glancing around nervously. They want to know who generates the analysis. And what did you tell them? Asked. The truth. He'd looked physically pained. I told them you do everything. The data collection, the analysis, the recommendations. All of it. How did they react? They didn't look surprised, Laurel. At all. His voice had dropped to barely a whisper. I think they already knew. I think they were testing whether I'd be honest. That confirmation had sent electricity through my veins. They'd been investigating quietly, building a case. Everything was falling into place naturally, inevitably. Evan, you should probably start documenting what you actually do versus what your job description says, I'd suggested gently. He'd nodded miserably and walked away. I'd almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Dalton had called an emergency meeting. Department heads only. He'd tried spinning some narrative about organizational restructuring and clarifying roles. But one of the directors had interrupted him calmly. Let's postpone this discussion until after your performance review next week, Trevor. Dalton's face had gone pale. What performance review? The one HR scheduled with you yesterday. Check your email. He'd fumbled for his phone, scrolling frantically. From across the table, I'd watched his face drain of color as he'd found the message. He hadn't been told about an early review. He'd assumed everything was routine quarterly evaluation. But I'd known. HR had copied me on several scheduling emails, asking for my availability to provide operational context. They were being thorough, building an airtight case. Dalton had tried recovering his composure. Of course, yes. That review. I'm fully prepared. But his hands had trembled slightly as he'd gathered his papers. Everyone in that room had noticed. The final audit summary had been released internally the following Monday. I'd received it through official channels since it pertained to systems I managed. The document was brutal in its factual precision. Operational analysis. Division 7. Key findings included performance metrics generated and maintained by Operations Coordinator L. Pritchard, not Operations Manager E. Novak or VPT Dalton. Compliance systems implemented and monitored by L. Pritchard with minimal oversight. Strategic recommendations attributed to VP Dalton originated from analysis conducted by L. Pritchard. Current operational structure does not reflect actual workflow or decision-making processes. The report recommended immediate organizational restructuring and personnel reassignment. That afternoon, Dalton had stormed into my workspace, wild-eyed and desperate. What did you do? He demanded, voice cracking. I'd looked up calmly from my computer. I reported accurate information when asked. That's all. You sabotaged me deliberately. No, I stopped protecting you. There's a difference. His face had contorted with rage and fear. This will destroy my career. You destroyed your own career when you took credit for work you didn't do. Monday morning arrived with shocking swiftness. I'd gotten to the office early as usual, made my coffee, settled into my routine. At 9:15, 2 security officers had appeared at Dalton's office. People had started gathering in doorways, watching quietly. Dalton had emerged 5 minutes later, carrying a small box of personal items, face completely blank. No goodbye speech. No farewell handshakes. The security officers had escorted him to the elevator and out of the building. Just like that, he was gone. Later that morning, an official announcement had gone out. Trevor Dalton has left his position as VP of Operations effective immediately. The departure stems from leadership conduct concerns and operational management discrepancies. We thank him for his service and wish him well. The email had been corporate speak for fired for cause. My phone had exploded with texts from colleagues. Did you know this was happening? Oh my God, Dalton's gone. This is insane. I'd replied to none of them. Just kept working quietly. HR had scheduled a meeting with me for Tuesday afternoon. Ms. Kumar had greeted me with a warm, professional smile. "Laurel, thank you for your patience through this difficult transition." I'd nodded, unsure what was coming. "After thorough review, we'd like to formally offer you the operations manager position." My breath had caught. "This is the role you've been performing unofficially for approximately 2 years," Ms. Kumar had continued. "The board has approved both the title change and a compensation adjustment that reflects your actual responsibilities." She'd slid a document across the desk. The salary was 40% higher than what I'd been making. More than I'd dared hope for. "We're also restructuring Mr. Novak's position to Business Development Liaison, a role that better matches his skills and experience. He's already been informed and has accepted." I'd stared at the paper, hardly believing this was real. "Do you need time to consider?" Ms. Kumar had asked gently. My hands had trembled slightly, not from fear but from overwhelming relief. "No," I'd managed. "I accept." Settling into my new role took several weeks. They'd given me an actual office, with a door, windows, and a nameplate that read Laurel Pritchard, Operations Manager. Colleagues had stopped by to congratulate me. Some had apologized for not speaking up during that awful meeting. Brianna had brought me flowers. "You earned this 10 times over," she'd said, hugging me tightly. Evan had apologized formally. I should have refused the promotion from the beginning. I knew it wasn't right. "You were put in an impossible position," I'd told him honestly. "I don't blame you." He'd looked relieved. The department had run more smoothly than ever. Without Dalton's ego-blocking decisions, we'd implemented changes I'd recommended months ago. Efficiency had increased. Morale had improved. People actually seemed happy to come to work. Ms. Torres, my former manager, had pulled me aside one afternoon. "You handled that situation with incredible professionalism," she'd said. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from Dalton earlier." "You couldn't have known," I'd replied. But privately, I'd wondered if she had known, and simply hadn't had enough power to intervene. 6 weeks after Dalton's departure, I'd been invited to present at the quarterly executive meeting. The same meeting where he'd once presented my work as his own. This time I'd stood at the front of the room, clicking through my own slides, explaining my own analysis. "Operational efficiency has increased 22% since restructuring," I'd reported. "Compliance scores have returned to optimal levels. Cross-departmental coordination has improved significantly." The executives had asked sharp questions. I'd answered each one confidently, backed by data I knew intimately because I'd generated it myself. At the end, the CEO had nodded approvingly. "Excellent work, Ms. Pritchard. This is the kind of operational leadership we need." Walking out of that meeting, I'd finally allowed myself to feel the victory. Not just the promotion, not just the salary increase, but the recognition, the validation, the proof that my work mattered, that I mattered. Looking back months later, sitting in my office with my door closed and my nameplate gleaming in the afternoon light, I finally understood what had happened. I hadn't destroyed Dalton through revenge. He'd destroyed himself through arrogance. I'd simply stopped enabling his incompetence. The truth had done the rest. My victory wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and earned through years of excellent work that finally received proper recognition. People sometimes asked me if I felt guilty about what happened to Dalton. I didn't. He'd made choices. He'd taken credit for work he hadn't done. He'd publicly humiliated me to protect his ego. The consequences were his own creation. I share this story for anyone who's ever been told they're not leadership material, by someone who couldn't lead effectively if their career depended on it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation. It's simply stopping to protect people from the natural consequences of their own incompetence. And sometimes being quiet doesn't mean being weak. It means being strategic, patient, and absolutely certain of your own worth. That certainty is more powerful than any tantrum could ever be.